All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Chris Date. This is actually my second time speaking with Chris Date. We had something between a debate and a discussion on Preston Sprinkle's podcast. I'll link that below in the description. But part of the reason that I want to talk with Chris today is that Chris has a new book out, which is a debate book between him and Dale Tuggy on the topic of sort of the incarnation and the identity of Jesus. And so I really appreciate Chris Date. I appreciate, among other things, as a fellow annihilationist or conditional immortality person, I like his website, Rethinking Hell. I think that he takes a very serious approach to scripture, and that I am excited that you're getting more interested into Trinitarian and incarnational topics. I think in general, I think we can both agree, even though we have plenty to disagree about, that the Trinity is somewhat of a neglected topic among evangelicals. And so even if we're going to disagree, I want to disagree with the best version of evangelical Trinitarianism that there is, and make sure that our disagreements are put to a sharp point, and instead of arguing about things that we don't really understand. So I appreciate to see Chris taking on these topics, even if we come at it from different perspectives. So we're not here today to rehash our debate or to settle any scores like that. I'm really just here to hear more from Chris's perspective and help flesh this out a little bit more. Do you have anything that you want to say in introduction to yourself?
No, I think you said it all well, with one exception, and that was calling me the best that evangelical Trinitarianism has to offer. That is definitely not me. Hopefully you're doing a little more than just scraping the bottom of the barrel by bringing me on, though.
I most certainly am. Trust, I know for certain that I am not scraping the bottom of the barrel. You have some kind of interesting and new arguments from an evangelical perspective in favor of the Trinity that I hadn't encountered before until reading your book. And in general, I think you said this in our talk on Preston's podcast, that we can probably both agree that among evangelical circles, and you sort of come specifically sort of from that kind of Calvinistic, restless and reformed sort of camp. I don't know if you like that label or not. If you don't like that label, sorry.
It's fine. It's just usually it's young, restless, and reformed, and young, I am by no means young any longer. So, yeah.
I didn't mean to exclude that word in particular. And that it does seem like the Trinity is strongly assumed, but very few people have gone into any depth on the topic from a theological perspective, a biblical perspective, and especially a historical perspective. And then you've done all three of those things. And that if my goal for this conversation is if we could help put out there a good example of you explaining and defending a version of that perspective, and me giving a little bit of pushback and some pointed questions and stuff like that to help move things along, that I would be perfectly happy with that as a product for this conversation.
Yeah, same here. I look forward to it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my first question is, so what is the Trinity? So how would you explain it briefly? And that will probably be a good launching point for going into the different particulars, because lots of people think that when they hear that word, they know what it's saying. But then when you ask them 2 or 3 questions deep, they start to get a little bit shaky. So I know that you can go way more than 2 or 3 questions deep. So how would you explain it sort of at a high level, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, at its simplest, I think the formulation that I like to give people for the first time is that according to the doctrine of the Trinity, there's one being that is God. But this one being that is God exists simultaneously and eternally as 3 distinct persons. And by person, I'm not using person in the sort of common parlance that we do when we talk about what a person is. This is a particular context in which this word carries a particular meaning, and we'll talk about what that is as the conversation continues. So the point of it is just to say that we Trinitarians affirm monotheism. Whether we can do so logically, or not, is of course the debate at hand. But we want to. We believe we're affirming monotheism because we believe there's just one God. But we believe the Father is God. We believe the Son is God, including his incarnate, including the incarnate Christ, who is the Son incarnate, and the Holy Spirit is God. But the three of them aren't identical to one another. So that's kind of the simple way of laying it out. But as you already stated, it's going to get a whole lot deeper pretty quick.
Right. So for an individual human, I am a human being and I'm also a human person, right? So we actually tend to use being and person basically interchangeably. But for a Trinitarian, these words have take on slightly divergent meaning when we can say there's one being and three persons. So if you wouldn't take a little bit more time clarifying what you mean by being, and then probably also what you mean by person.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say that we really could have this conversation with any other word in place of person. The point of it isn't the word person, but the concept behind it. Whether or not we continue to use the word person is another
Sure.
question. So being in Trinitarian terms is kind of like referring to the substance, using philosophical jargon, in which person subsists. Now that isn't obviously clear right off the bat, but the idea, when we talk about philosophical use of the word substance, we're talking about one concrete entity, like a rock, for example. And then there are realities that are not concrete entities, but which subsist in the being of a rock. So for example, and obviously there's going to be a big difference between what I'm about to describe and what we Trinitarians mean by person, but there is a little bit of overlap. Namely, think about the quality that is the rock's hardness, all right? The rock's hardness is not a concrete entity on its own. The rock's opacity is not a concrete entity of its own. These are properties that subsist in the being of the rock, the substance of the rock. And so what we can say is that there's one being that is the rock, but there are all these properties that subsist in the being of the rock that are not identical to one another. So that's kind of what I mean by being. I'm talking about one concrete entity. In the case of a spiritual being like God, we're talking about one substance, one simple substance. Most philosophers would say that God is simple, that angelic beings are simple. I think they would say that the human soul is simple, meaning that it's not divisible into, it's not made up of parts. And when we're talking about human beings, we're typically talking about a unity of two substances, the substance that is our physical body and the substance that most Christian philosophers through the years have believed to be the immaterial human soul. So that's what I mean by being. I'm talking about the substance that is the concrete thing that is God, or in the case of humans, the substances that make up a human being, the body and soul.
But you're using, when you say concrete, you don't mean physical, right? Because
no, that's right.
Neither of us think that God is a physical substance or a physical thing that I can poke at.
That's right. Yeah, right. Substance and concrete are both words that, because of their semantic range, can be a little confusing here.
Sure. So there's one being, and this is why it's monotheism, right? There's only one God being. There are no other God beings.
Right.
But yet there's something kind of multifaceted within this God being that makes it multi-personal, even if by person we don't mean exactly what we mean in sort of everyday English, like when I interact with a person. So then I guess that sort of leads us logically into, so what exactly do you mean by person? And I think this was a little bit related to some of our confusion when we had our discussion with Preston Sprinkle, is that I might have been mishearing you a little bit when you said the word person. So I'd love to hear what precisely you meant by that.
Yeah, so the church fathers, to the best of my knowledge, and I am no expert on the history of Trinitarian thought, but the church fathers who talked about the Trinity, because and that's important because as I'm sure you know, the language, Trinitarian language, came into being, a few hundred years after Christ. And so I'm here talking, in my book, I make the case that even before that, church fathers believed that Jesus is deity. But when we're talking about Trinitarian language specifically, they made a distinction between substance and subsistence. The being of God is the substance, the one concrete entity. The persons in their thinking were not concrete entities in the way that the being of God is. They are subsistences within God. They are things that subsist within the being of God. Many of those fathers, and even I think some Trinitarians today, would say that the persons, the things that subsist in the being of God, are just the relationships between Father, Son, Son and Holy Spirit, and Father and Holy Spirit. So, for example, you'll hear very learned, much more learned Trinitarians than I am talking about like the filial relationship, the relationship of the Son to the Father, or the spirating relationship, the relationship of the Spirit to the Father. And many of these earliest Christians that first started using Trinitarian language meant that the person is identical to this relationship. Now, I struggle with that, and I don't accept it yet anyway, because I don't know how you can have a relationship between without there being two things that can be related. So I am falling more in line with what would be called social Trinitarianism, which is the idea that these persons, these subsistences or whatever, are indeed personal selves. And that's what I want to argue for here, is that person in Trinitarian language is what it means to be a personal self. So I think this distinction holds true even in humanity. So for example, I can speak of my soul. And if I were a traditional Christian dualist, a Cartesian dualist, I would my personality, my mind would be my soul. So then what is it to which the soul belongs, such that I can refer to my soul? And because I'm not a classical sort of Cartesian dualist, I'm comfortable taking it even a step further and saying, what is the my when I refer to my being, right? My being is everything that makes me up. So then what is the my there? It doesn't seem to make sense unless, and this is what I think, this way of speaking, my soul, my being, what I think it hints at is that there's a distinction between a being, there's a distinction between a being that's personal and the personal self to whom that being belongs. And I quote a Catholic theologian in the book who puts it this way: the being is that through which or in which the person lives and acts and experiences. So everything that makes up this concrete being that is Chris is that through which the personal self that subsists in the being of Chris experiences everything that it experiences. So going back to the Trinity, the idea here is that because God is infinite, unlike us, because God is transcendent, unlike us, and so forth, he's not bound by the same limitations of created nature that we are. And so whereas we are one personal self that subsists in one being, and that's universally true of humankind, the being of God is shared by three such personal selves that all simultaneously subsist within the one being of God. That's how I would lay it out.
So selfhood, and this is in your book with Dale Tuggy. Dale Tuggy uses the word self a lot, right? That's very, very important to his sort of language and his ontology. So you would put selfhood in the layer of person, but
Correct.
you would not put selfhood at the layer of being. So there is no and so each of us as a human, we have a self, but the self somehow kind of is encapsulated and subsists within our beingness, right? And
such that it can be referred to as yourself's being.
Right. So I, Sam, have Sam's being, which is in some sense larger than my selfhood. My selfhood is fully inside of my being and part of my being, but my being is almost bigger, and maybe bigger isn't even the right word, but more fundamental or something like that. And
Well, I like the concrete and non-concrete distinction.
okay.
Right. Go back to my example of here's an analogy I use in my book. The Earth has a magnetic field and it has a gravitational field, but those fields are not concrete entities in and of themselves. Fields are ways of speaking about the forces exerted by the concrete entity, which is the Earth. And of course, the Earth isn't bigger; it's quite actually smaller than the magnetic field and the gravitational field. But those things subsist within the being of Earth. And so we can speak of the Earth, but we can also speak of the gravitational field and the magnetic field, and they're not the same thing, but they do subsist equally in the same thing, which is the being of the Earth.
Okay. So there's one being of God, and there are three selves who subsist within the being of God. But
That's my view, yeah.
But yeah, right. I'm really just trying to make sure that I am properly characterizing you. And
Yep.
so the Father, Son, and Spirit are selves and have sort of, I don't know, the internal experience of being a self, I guess. And whereas the being of God does not have a sense of selfhood itself, right? But there are three selfhoods in the being.
Yeah, sure. Provided that by self here, we're talking specifically about a personal self, because you could say that a rock has a self, right? Because we can refer to the rock itself, right?
Right.
But of course, that self is a little bit different than what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I prefer personal self. That's the way I
Personal
like to speak
self.
of
Sure.
person. Yeah.
So there isn't a personal self that's God. There's a personal self that's the Son and the Father and the Spirit. Three personal selves, but no personal self that is all of God. There is a being that is all of God.
Yes, you in the very precise way of using the word "is" to refer to the "is" of identity, right? So this is one of the things I try to explain in the book, is that it's not untrue to say the Father is God, the Son is God, but the Father is not the Son. It's just using "is" in two ways, right?
Right.
So as I'm sure you know from reading the book, when we say the Father is God, I argue that that's shorthand. That's shorthand for a more complicated concept, which is the Father, the person that is the Father subsists in the being of God. Now, that's the only thing that we can really relate to speaking of in that way is the personal self that we are familiar with. I am Chris, but I'm not identical to my being. But that's why it's hard to wrap our heads around this, in my opinion, is because we don't think of that in any other kind of thing that subsists in some kind of thing. I would never say, for example, that the gravitational field is the Earth, right? So this shorthand that I'm alleging is represented by the phrase "the Father is God" is something that is hard to relate to, because the only thing that we do that kind of similar thing with is when we talk about our own personal self. Everything else that subsists in another thing, I can't think of anything else that we speak of with the shorthand "is" in that way.
Sure. I know that this is a loaded question, and I'm really not trying to trap you.
Sure.
But would you say that the Father, Son, and Spirit are parts of God?
Oh, very much not.
Okay.
For example, and for the whole, because of this whole very concept of subsistence, going back to my example of the fields of the Earth, the gravitational field is not part of Earth, right? You can't locate some part of the Earth and say that's its gravitational field. The gravitational field describes the forces that are exerted by the whole concrete object that is the Earth, and same with the magnetic field. So this is why I think, or one reason why I think this distinction between substance and subsistence is so important historically, is because once you talk about something that subsists in a concrete entity, it's probably very rare, if not never, the case that we speak of the thing that subsists as part of the thing in which it subsists.
Okay, all right. I see what you're saying. So I've been recently trying to understand William Lane Craig's theory of the Trinity. And as you might know, he basically he kind of doesn't like to say it, but it really is true that what he means by the persons are parts. And
oh, you like the dog Cerberus, right?
yes,
That he uses as the analogy, yeah.
Yes, right. Where it's like the really in William Lane Craig's Trinity, he seems to think that this is a naughty word, but it still is an accurate word, that the Son is part of God and the Father is part of God and the Spirit is part of God. And so, but you're not saying something like that.
Right. Yeah. All I'm saying is basically the same thing as if I were to say, I subsist in my being, and that's also true of God, except thrice over. So, I am not part of my being, and what's more, there's no part of my being that in which I don't subsist. Right? My toenails. I subsist in my toenails every bit as much as I do my brain, my head, my chest, and so forth. My whole being is that in which my personal self subsists. And I think that's true of God as well, except there are 3 such personal selves, which, as you'll have read in my book, one of the things that one of the arguments that Dale Tuggy has made in his book, What is a Trinity, and I suspect that he's made it elsewhere, is that personhood is sort of universally recognized throughout humankind as being, you refer to a person, you're referring to one single human being. And he's right, but I want to ask, so what? Right? God is also omniscient. What other creatures are omniscient? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're familiar with only what it means to be limited in knowledge, because that's the universal human experience, so what? What does that tell us about what it means to be God and have the kind of knowledge he does?
So this is just another part of the absolute uniqueness of God is this tripersonality.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think there's any other multi-personal being whatsoever.
Interesting. Okay. And honestly, God gets to be unique. I don't
Sure.
necessarily agree with you that this is one of his uniquenesses, but I see what you're saying, that it could be entirely possible that if anyone gets to be unique and special in such a way, God would be that. So yeah, I don't think that's inherently contradictory. I'll say I'll give you a pass on that one.
Okay. Well, but let me just, so I'm going to take a bit of a risk here. When I was preparing for my original live debate with Dr. Tuggy, I had much of my presentation as I originally had put it together was very different. I had a large number of slides intending to demonstrate that although we don't know of any actual multi-personal being, we nevertheless have examples in art and fiction that do helpfully demonstrate that there's a distinction, and that the distinction in some cases can be more than just one-to-one. So for example, I don't know if you're familiar with comic book characters that have the ability to sort of split into multiple versions of themselves and then collapse back in on themselves. One example is a guy named Multiple Man in the X-Men comics. If you've ever watched the kids movie Sky High, which is superhero kids going to high school, there's this cheerleader, and this cheerleader has the power. She splits out into multiple versions of herself, and those versions of herself interact with one another. There's a relationship between them, but this is all one being. You've got this one being who at any given moment can be one person or multiple persons. When it's one person, it's just one person, but then all of a sudden there'll be multiple persons in this one single being that interact with one another, that do cheers together, stuff like that. And although the analogy is imperfect, I think it's it doesn't go so far as to match the kind of multi-personality we're talking about in God. Nevertheless, this is one kind of example in art that I think does demonstrate that it's at least within our realm of ability to imagine that there's a greater complexity to person and being than we're ordinarily accustomed to.
Okay. I see what you're saying. You're not trying to stretch those analogies too far, right? But you're saying that something like that is within our imagination. So something like that could be a way that we could try and imagine the Trinity, right?
Well, I think I'd be a little more careful than that. I think what I'd want to say is just that this kind of example and other ones that I had originally planned to do, they they demonstrate that it's possible to get more complicated than just a one-to-one person and being than we're used to. I wouldn't say it's a helpful way of thinking about the Trinity for one very good reason, if no other, which is that in all these examples I've given, any one person does in fact subsist in a part of that being, right? Because when you've got the cheerleader that splits out into multiple versions of herself and they interact with one another, the person over there is subsisting in only that part of that being, right? The one that's over there. Whereas here with God, we're talking about the person subsisting wholly in the one being of God. So I wouldn't want to say this is a way to think about the Trinity. I would want to say, though, that it demonstrates, I think anyway, that things can get more complex than we're used to.
Okay. So then that brings up the question of relations between the persons, right? So in the example of a superhero cheerleader who can suddenly multiply themselves into multiple cheerleaders, there's something identical about, presumably, about all of the multiplied cheerleaders. But yet at the same time, we want to say different things about the Father, different things about the Son, different things about the Spirit. And so I guess in historical Trinitarianism, or at least most of it, there is the idea of sort of these processional relationships, such that the Son is begotten of the Father, the Spirit is breathed out or spirated from the Father and or the Son. That's a controversial issue between Eastern Orthodox and Catholics.
Indeed.
But I'm wondering, do you affirm that sort of thing? Do you deny that sort of thing? Or how does that fit into your understanding of the persons of the Trinity, those sorts of relationships?
I don't really take a position on that. I don't see any biblical reason to affirm it, but there are historical reasons to at least consider that way of speaking. What I will say, though, is that that way of speaking is not at all inconsistent even with the example of the cheerleader, because even though this cheerleader, I wish I could remember her name off the top of my head, but I can't. But anyway, if people watch the movie Sky High, or if they watch X-Men and see Multiple Man, or the Watchmen with Dr. Oh gosh, I don't remember. He's the big blue guy who can grow to huge size, but he can also split into multiple selves. Anyway, all of these examples, there is still sort of a root from which all of these other persons derive. And so it's, now the difference, of course, is that in all of these other examples, that derivation is temporal, right? You have at one point, whereas in God, the people that you're talking about, who talk about the Son proceeding from the Father and possibly the Son or the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, they are not saying that that's a temporal procession. It wasn't as if there was a time where it wasn't proceeding and then it was. The beginning and the spirating is eternal. So I'm open to that. I don't think there's anything logically problematic about it, but I also am reluctant to embrace something that goes beyond anything that could possibly be derived from Scripture. So that's why I'm reluctant to embrace that.
Sure. I have a couple follow-up questions to that. First question, begotten. Right. So this is a scriptural word, right? The Son is begotten of the Father. So how do you understand that to mean? Is that an eternal thing, or does that simply refer to the earthly human Jesus, I guess?
I think it's a reference to the incarnate Son. Yeah, I think the beginning is a reference. Yeah. I don't see, now if you can point me to anywhere where Trinitarians argue that the language of begetting refers to the Son proper, in timeless eternity, then I'm open to it, but I'm not aware. Everywhere where I see that kind of argument being made from the word beget or words like it, it always has to do with the incarnate Son.
So that is where you and I will agree, but that is where you might differ from, say, Augustine and a bunch of sort of the Trinitarian historical mainstream, who was very firm to argue that this begetting is an eternal thing of eternity past between the Father and the Son. And there are some verses that I know that the historical Trinitarians in like the 4th and 5th century used to use to support that idea. I think you and I would probably agree that they were both somewhat ridiculous. But so that's interesting. That's something that you and William Lane Craig do share. Like I said, I've been trying to figure out what William Lane Craig thinks of this whole Trinity business, and he's somewhat unique. But he uses the relationship of begetting solely in the incarnational relationship between the Father and the incarnate human Son, as opposed to an eternity past
Yeah.
begetting of the Father and the Son.
Well, and if that's the case, I suspect that it's in part because in part, he, like me, does not think that the identity of the Son is something that is eternal into the past. Right. There's this concept of eternal subordination of the Son to the Father. And if indeed the Father has always been the Father as such, and the Son has always been the Son as such, then it would make sense that there would be this eternal subordination between the Son and the Father, because that's part and parcel of the relationship between a Father and a Son. But I don't see any evidence in Scripture that the Son was, prior to the incarnation, subordinate to his Father in a father-son relationship. And I'm sure you're going to be one of the first to agree that the Old Testament certainly doesn't speak about the Son in the way that Trinitarians who believe in eternal subordination of the Son to the Father think the Old Testament refers to the Son. So yeah, it's not that I reject the concept of the eternal subordination and the eternal sonhood of the Son and so forth. It's just that, again, I'm reluctant to embrace something that I don't see able to be derived from Scripture.
Mm-hmm. And let me also say, I actually don't find the trait of having your chips in a couple different pots to be a bad thing. Right? Sure. If you say, I could go this way or could go this way, I don't have a firm stance, I actually find that somewhat admirable and not necessarily a bad thing. So I don't necessarily feel the need to box you in, or else you're inconsistent or double-minded or something like that. So if you say I could go either way on something like that, fine. I'm not the sort of person who wants to fight against that trend.
Well, as admirable as it may or may not be, it's certainly not selfless. I'm doing it so that I don't get into hot water until I absolutely have to. You know what I mean?
Fair enough. Okay, so speaking of putting you into hot water, so sure. a very related question. So in Unitarian land at the moment, there is a red hot debate over what to do with some Eastern Orthodox monarchical Trinitarians. And there's a red hot counter debate coming from some of these monarchical Trinitarians, mainly Beau Branson and Dale Tuggy, or Dale Tuggy being the co-author of your book, are in somewhat of a dispute over the definition of Unitarianism, which you might find interesting, because Dale Tuggy has his definitions of Unitarianism, Trinitarianism. And according to these definitions, it seems like monarchical Trinitarianism, which is a minority, but not a substantial minority in an academically respected minority position within Eastern Orthodoxy, which basically I would say is that in monarchical Trinitarianism, God is God the Father, and he begets the Son eternally and spirates out or breathes out the Spirit eternally. But in a certain sense, God isn't tripersonal, like in your model. God is unipersonal of the Father, and that he shares his essence with the Son and the Spirit eternally. And so it's like, well, is that Trinitarian or is that Unitarian? Because you have one person being God, but yet you have three people with the divine essence. So the monarchical Trinitarians are like, we're Trinitarian. And the Unitarians are like, we might think you're actually Unitarian. And so there's actually an interesting spat going on. But the question that I want to relate to you from this is that is the question of aseity. So aseity means not being caused by anything else, being your own self-cause, right? Where you and I, Chris, are caused, our beings are caused and dependent upon God, whereas God does not have his being dependent upon anyone else.
let me offer what might be a correction. I wouldn't
Sure.
say that aseity means one is one's own cause. I would argue that aseity means that one is uncaused. Right? That's why we talk about. Okay. All right. Just making sure.
Fair enough. Actually, you're probably right about that.
Okay.
So the monarchical Trinitarians like Beau Branson will say that God the Father is uncaused, ase, whereas the Son and the Spirit are caused, owing their cause to the Father. And what they point out is that you can find that sort of language in Augustine and even in Aquinas and even in like Martin Luther, that there's this tradition of God being the Father being uncaused, but the Son and the Spirit being caused, namely by the Father. And so they say, if you're going to call us Unitarians, then you basically have to call Augustine and Aquinas and Martin Luther Unitarians, and you probably don't want to do that. So therefore, adjust your definitions, Dale Tuggy. But what I'm asking you is how do you imagine aseity, and do you owe that to just the person of the Father or to the being God? How do you think of aseity, I guess, in your Trinitarian understanding? And if you don't want to commit either way, again, I won't hold your feet to the fire.
No. I mean, my current position is that all three persons have aseity, but it's precisely because I think aseity is again a property that subsists in the being of God. And since all three persons eternally share the being of God, I take it to be that they are all ase. Now, I don't necessarily think that means that a monarchian Trinitarianism, which would attribute aseity only to the Father, would necessarily therefore fail to qualify as Trinitarian. Here's another analogy. And I actually got this from, I want to say Loftus in this edited book on Trinitarian thought that I've got. Anyway, he gives an analogy of what are those dancers that dance in a line and they kick their Rockettes, right? So imagine you've got a dancer, like a Rockette dancer, and somehow she goes back in time. So she's on the stage dancing, and then when the dance is over, she goes back in time, and now she dances next to herself dancing. And then let's say she goes back in time again, and now she stands next to the two past versions of herself that are dancing. So now you've got three instances of herself all dancing side by side. And this, of course, the analogy fails because it is temporal. But now that you have those three dancers, which is really just one dancer, but thrice all at the same time, dancing next to each other, and you pretend that that's been the state of affairs for eternity, well, then what a monarchian Trinitarian could say is it's very true that there is, in fact, one of these dancers from whom the second one proceeds. And the third one proceeds from the first and from the second, logically speaking. Even if this has been a state of affairs throughout all eternity, nevertheless, there's this logical procession, and only the first of them would be ase in the analogous way of speaking. The other two are derived logically from the first.
Yeah, and when I've talked with Beau Branson, that's something that he sort of emphasizes is that the Son is caused, but not caused in time. He's right. In fact very important about it, very strict about that. And an example that I thought that sort of makes sense to sort of a modern mind is like the laws of chemistry depend upon the laws of physics, and the laws of biology depend upon the laws of chemistry, right? But it's not like the laws of physics are older than the laws of chemistry or the laws of biology. It's more like they're logically more fundamental or something, right?
Yeah, or here's another real simple analogy. Consider a light bulb. The way that a light bulb produces light is that electricity begins flowing through the filament. But the instant that the electricity flows through the filament, light is produced. So they're simultaneous, but the light, is logically dependent upon the other, the electricity flowing through the filament. So yeah, I think this is, although this isn't my view of the Trinity, it nevertheless does not strike me as disqualified as Trinitarianism.
Right.
So at least not for that reason.
So that's interesting. So when I've been talking with Beau Branson, he'll kind of blame Calvin as being one of the first to assert the aseity, or the autotheosidicity, if that's the right word, the God from Godness of the Son. Whereas he would say, and I think he's probably right, that almost all Trinitarians in the tradition beforehand would said that the Son is God from God, like the Nicene Creed says, and that Calvin was sort of the first to say, no, the Son is also God in himself, in a way that I think maybe the same way that the Father is what Calvin would say. And I know you're in the Reformed Calvinist tradition, so it seems like you're in your home turf, really, to assert the aseity of all three persons.
Well, to be fair, I suspect that, I suspect that the large majority of non-Calvinist Trinitarians, at least in evangelical Christianity, are probably also hold to the aseity of all three divine persons. So I wouldn't necessarily call it distinctly Reformed, even if it's true, and I just don't know if it is or not, that Calvin is really the first to popularize the notion of all three persons being ase.
For the record, my church's statement of faith has all three persons being ase. I honestly think that like 99% of evangelicals have never stopped to think about what that means. But
probably not.
But I again, like I've said, you're a good example, and you've thought through these things way more than is average, which is why you're a fun person to talk about. So that's interesting. So like if I were to try and describe what you're saying, just to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly. So like if I were to say, I, Sam, am white, blue, and blonde, or I guess I should say I'm white, blue, and brown, right? That sounds on the surface like it could be a contradiction, right? But actually I'm white in terms of my ethnicity. I am blue, maybe if I'm feeling sad today, I am blue. And then I am brown in terms of my hair color, right? And
well, but see, that I was going to stop you at blue until you made clear that by blue you meant sad, because it's possible to be, and anytime you've been sad, it's been true that you've been white and sad. But I don't think it would be accurate to say you're brown, because you're not. Your hair is brown. Right?
Okay.
And the reason I was going to stop you at blue is because I thought maybe you were talking about your eyes. Your irises might be blue, but obviously you were talking about something else. Sure.
Okay. So it's like different categories of attribution or something like that. And we have different, we humans have different categories of which things can be true of us simultaneously. Like my ethnicity, like my mood, and like I could say I'm white, blue, and tan, right? Or something like that. If I had gone to the beach on a beach vacation recently, right? I could be white ethnically, blue mood-wise, and tan in terms of my skin hue or something like that, right? And those are three different ways of being that are true of me simultaneously, but they aren't different parts, but it's sort of like they're different categories of description, or perhaps.
Yeah, well, and one category they're obviously not is the category of personal self, and that's why these are only going to go so far. And even the analogies I use in the book only go so far for that very reason, but yeah.
And so you're saying something like, in a unique fashion, because this isn't true of anything else that I can think of, and if anyone gets to be unique, God gets to be unique, that there are different venues of description, different categories of description that are in fact personal, that are true simultaneously of the being God. Because the weird thing about it is, like, imagine like God, so this isn't, maybe the most applicable example, but imagine God the Father were happy, God the Son were sad, and God the Spirit was contemplative or something like that, right? It's the same category of mood, but it's true of the being God in terms of three different persons.
Yeah, except I think the challenge there may be that I don't think you can speak about any person's mood without it also being a reflection of their being as well, right? If I'm sad, that's because I am experiencing the emotion of sadness through those parts of my being that account for the experience of sadness, right?
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
but of course, if that's true also of what it means for any divine person to be sad, then it would be impossible for the Father to be sad, but the Son to be, or the Father to be happy, but the Son to be sad, because they share the being of this one being, and in order for that to be true, they would share only part of the being of God in any given time.
All right. So then that brings up the question of how can they be different at all? And so at the baptism of Jesus, God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." The Son is the one getting baptized, and the Spirit is descending upon the Son in the form of a dove. Presumably you would agree with that interpretation. So there are three, those are different things, different descriptions of the three persons happening simultaneously. How would you sort of make sense of that or describe that in your model?
So when we come to the Son, we're talking about something different than when it comes to the Father and the Holy Spirit, because here we're talking about the incarnate Son, and you'll know from having read the book that I have a couple of ways of explaining how I think the incarnate Son can experience what would otherwise be logically contradictory properties than the Father, precisely because he's incarnate. So we can get to that if and when you want to get to that. But more generally, you've got to understand that, at least from my perspective, and I think this is a pretty classical view, the being of God does not exist within this, for lack of a better way of putting it, and at risk of sounding a little science fiction-y, this dimension, right? He's transcendent. His being exists beyond the created cosmos, which includes time and space. And so here's an analogy that is imperfect, again, as all analogies are, but consider the relationship between an author and the story that the author has crafted. That author is wholly transcendent of the story that the author has come up with. The whole story exists from start to finish in the mind all at once of the author, who is in a whole nother level, if you want to put it, or dimension of time or whatever. And if the author wanted to appear within this story over which he is transcendent, and do so simultaneously, thrice over at the same time, there's nothing that prevents the transcendent author from manifesting in the story in ways that would be impossible for any of the creatures inside that story, and it wouldn't be it wouldn't conflict at all with what it means to be the author, because again, he's transcendent. So what I would say is that the three persons are distinguishable in time by their actions. But their actions, especially if divine timelessness is true, right? Which is a whole nother level. According to divine timelessness, God and divine simplicity, the being of God is just like pure act, and there's no change in God, and so there would be no distinction between activities in the Godhead in timeless eternity. But in time, that one being that is thrice personal can act in time in ways that are distinguishable from one another, precisely because his being transcends that created cosmos. And as soon as you have that transcendent relationship, I think that distinctions that are impossible outside of the created cosmos can be discerned within time.
Okay, and I definitely want to transition to the incarnation soon, but I think maybe my last question before we do so is, so still in the baptism you have the Father and the Spirit, neither of which are incarnate, and they seem to be doing different things. For example, the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son," and the Spirit descending in the form of a dove. So what ground would make them differentiated if it seems like they're very united, in your view, in participating in the same, or subsisting in the same being?
Because that being it transcends created time, and what you're referring to are actions that are recorded as having taken place in time. So if you've got this pure act, this simple divine being outside of time, in which you would not be able to discern between one person's actions and another, outside of time, that would be true, but they transcend created time, and in time, they can manifest and act in ways that differ from one another, because the divine being that is inseparable, indivisible, whatever, that exists outside of time, outside of this created time at least, even if they are not outside of time altogether. So I don't see any logical contradiction there. The fact that you can discern a difference between what the Father is doing and what the Son is doing in time does not mean that they are distinguishable outside of time, in which they share the one being of God.
Okay, so how do the persons of the Trinity decide which one is going to be the Father and which one's going to be the Spirit in time? It seems like, in your view, there would be no way to determine which person would be which, because they're so identical. It's almost like, do they draw straws to pick who's going to be which role in the play? I get how did they figure out who's going to be the one who speaks as Father and who's going to be the one who descends as a dove?
Well, so first of all, again, if divine timelessness and divine simplicity, this sort of very high classical theology, is true, then all decisions God has ever and will ever have made were all simultaneous in timeless eternity. And we would say, people who hold to that kind of very high classical theology, I think, would say that that decision was perfectly made in perfect unity between the persons in timeless eternity past, at that instant of act that is, again, in timeless eternity. But even somebody who doesn't necessarily go that far in a very high classical theology, I think, could say that, and should say, certainly at the very least, that there is no disunity in thought in the persons as they subsist in the divine being. It's not as if the Father or the Son and the Spirit have to deliberate with one another to figure out who's going to do what. They are in perfect agreement at all times in all eternity, and whether that was an instant in timeless eternity past, or whether God is somehow in some sort of transcendent time from ours, either way, it's not like they have to deliberate. They instantaneously and perfectly agree on exactly what they're going to do in time.
Okay, but that still doesn't seem to solve the problem of differentiation. So even if it's timeless, even if it's timeless, how is it such that they are different at all?
Well, they're only different in as much as they are different personal selves that all subsist within the one divine being.
But the Father and the Spirit, at least, seem to do different things.
Only in time.
Only in time, but what makes it such that there could be two different persons who did two different things? It seems like there would only be two persons who could do the exact same thing, because there's no beforehand which makes them distinguished in their role or capacity.
Imagine, like I said, you're an author. Okay. And you want to write a book and or a story, and even before you put pen to paper, the story is in your mind, all right? And in your story, you become incarnate. Actually, let me not go that far, because I don't want to get in the incarnation until we get to the incarnation. But in the story, you want to interact with the characters in your story. And let's say that you want to interact with two different people at the same point in time in your story, but on other sides of the world. What's preventing you from doing that? You're only one person outside of time. You're certainly only one being outside of the time of the story that exists within your mind. But in that story, you can simultaneously speak different things to these two different people at the story at the same point in time, precisely because you transcend that story. So the distinctions in terms of act aren't outside of time in where you exist naturally. They exist inside of the thing that you transcend. And I don't see any logical contradiction there.
So like the three cheerleader example, and I know that that's sort of like a tentative example. I'm not pushing I'm not going to push it too hard on you, but there's like one who's first, one who is second, and one who is third in the Rocketettes who are,
Yeah.
fluttering their legs, right? And it's almost arbitrary in a certain sense, which one's first, which one's second, and which one's third, right? It just, there need to be one who is first, there need to be one who is second, there need to be one who is third.
It wasn't even in the analogy, just to be clear, it's not even like there had to be. It's just simply the nature of the procession. Before the first time that the Rockette went back in time, there was only her. It's not arbitrary. It's just by nature the way that that the state of affairs came about as a result of her going back in time twice over.
Mm-hmm. I have an open letter on Letter Wiki. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's like this open platform where you can write people letters to a friend of mine named Trip Parker, who's been on my channel before. And he's similar to you. He grew up young, restless, and reformed, but is somehow a Thomas of Aquinas geek. And I'll just use this to publicly prod him that the ball's in his court on our letter. But the question that I asked him was something along these lines, is that if the persons are everything that's true of the persons is true of them essentially, right? And they all share the same essence, namely being the essence of God, then it seems like everything about them would be identical. But the problem is the Father and the Son and the Spirit seem not quite identical in the New Testament revelation. So that's where it seems to me like you don't have something that allows you to be differentiation. Whereas like a monarchical Trinitarian could say the Father is uniquely the Father because he's ase, the Son's unique because he's the begotten one, and the Spirit's unique because he's the spirated one. But it doesn't seem like you even have that to allow there to be differentiation. So it still seems kind of weird to me. It seems like in eternity past, you have three perfectly identical persons who have relations to each other, but there's almost nothing unique about them other than they're not that person and they're not that person. And so how does it come to be that they seem to serve such different roles? Because like I said, it seems like it would almost be an arbitrary casting to pick which one was the Father, which one was the Son, and which one was the Spirit.
It depends on what you mean by arbitrary. I mean, so for example, in the Calvinist-Arminian debate or the Calvinist-non-Calvinist debate, non-Calvinists like to very often pretend as if in Calvinism God is making an arbitrary choice. But the reason that they can pretend to do that is because they're understanding arbitrary to just mean no apparent reason. But I take arbitrary to mean there is no reason. And there may be no apparent reason to us why the three persons of the Godhead who share perfectly the one divine being outside of time, why there may be no apparent reason to us why it is that one of those three persons in time is the Father, and another one is the Son in time, and another one is the Holy Spirit in time. But just because we can't think of any reason why those distinctions would exist doesn't mean that there isn't in fact a reason. And I don't think that whatever that reason is can only possibly be that there is some sort of hierarchical relationship between the persons or some kind of difference between the persons that makes the Trinity impossible. Because remember, so you said something really important. You said there's nothing, everything that's true about one is true of each of the others. But that's only true when we're talking about truths of the being of God that they share. But the very nature of these three persons subsisting simultaneously in the one being of God, that subsistence reality is what enables them to be distinguished from one another. It's not that they are indistinguishable from one another, or that everything that is true of them full stop is true of the other. It's that everything that is true of the divine being is simultaneously and completely true of all three. So what you would have to...
Are there possible individuating characteristics? Like I have my essential properties and then I have my individuating properties. Would you say that there are individuating properties of the three persons?
I would struggle to think of what could possibly be a property of a person that isn't also in some way a property of the being in which the person subsists. So I'm, at least at this point, reluctant to say that there are properties of the Father and there are properties of the Son, but those properties are different between the two, which could only be possible if those weren't also properties of some aspect of the being they share. I'm reluctant to do that because I can't imagine what that could possibly be. I'm open to it, and as God is able to be unique in ways that we can't comprehend. But that's why, for the time being, I'm only prepared to say they're distinguishable from one another, in as much as each person subsists, within the being of God simultaneously. But I wholeheartedly agree that everything that is true of the being of God is simultaneously 100% true of every single person that subsists. But again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that as soon as you introduce this concept of a created time, a created cosmos and time, over which the divine being is transcendent, then the three divine persons can act differently in time, because the divine being doesn't exist in time. Right.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think I'm about ready to switch to the Incarnation, because I want to give some time for that. But it does seem like a difference between you and, say, maybe someone like Beau Branson is Beau Branson differentiates the persons into eternity past, where it seems like you differentiate the persons in their relations to temporality. And
No, because it's outside of created temporality that the three divine persons all simultaneously and eternally subsist in the divine being. So they
right. Well,
so they
what makes them unique from each other, right? What makes the Father the fatherness and the Son have sonness and the Spirit have spiritness?
That's right. I'm not prepared at this point to accept that there is some distinguishable feature there. I think that the relationship that is the relationship between Father and Son is a relationship that began at the Incarnation. But
when would the relationship between, say, the Father and the Spirit of spirating, or the spirit ofness of the Spirit, have began, or not began?
Probably creation. Mm-hmm. Right? It's at the moment of creation that you see the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters. Now, I just want to make one thing clear, though, lest any of my fellow Trinitarians think I've gone off the deep end here. I'm not saying that that the interrelation between any of the two divine persons began at some point in time. I'm just saying the specific kind of relationship between Father and Son, as Father and Son, is something that I'm inclined to think began at the Incarnation. Those two divine persons, three of them actually, preceded that to whatever extent we can speak of preceding in transcendence. But again, it's the specific relationship between Father and Son, what it means to be a father and what it means to be a son of a father, that began at Incarnation.
Is temporal. So the Father and Son have an eternal relationship from eternity past, but the aspect of that relationship being paternal, or
correct,
is temporal.
That's my view, yes.
Okay, sure. All right. I'm not going to say that makes sense or doesn't make sense, but that's interesting. That is a difference, I guess, between you and, say, Eastern Orthodox.
Well, as Dale Tuggy is so fond of saying, incorrectly, mind you, he refers to it as a number of different Trinity theories, as if there's not just one Trinity, there's a whole variety of them. That's simply false. What you have are variations on a core theme. You have, I would argue anyway, I shouldn't say it's simply false. I allege that it's simply false. What you have is the core of what it means for the Trinity to be true, one being in three persons. But then there's all these other ways of accounting for that fact and how it manifests in Scripture, how it appears to us in Scripture. And that's why you get these differences between social Trinitarianism and Latin Trinitarianism and Eastern Orthodox monarchical Trinitarianism, what have you. These are all ways, I think, these are all variations on a core theme. And it's that core theme that I'm calling the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right, and just like in annihilationism, we both know that there's actually flavors of annihilationism. Indeed. Too. Yeah, right. And honestly, to cut against Dale Tuggy a little bit, the more versions of a family of theories, the more members of a family of theories that there are, the more likely that one of those members is the true one. right?
I didn't think of that. That's a good, fair point.
So just because there are multiple Trinity theories, which I think is true, and you just kind of, I'm not saying anything more or less than what you just said. The more variations that there are, the more possibility that someone in that family is right, not less.
Or, it could also be that the core is true, but that no variation that is yet to be expressed, or that has yet been expressed, is actually accurate. I'm open to that possibility as well.
Yeah. So while I think it is a little bit surprising when some not very well educated Trinitarians learn that there's actually so much variety and diversity and disagreement within the larger tent of Trinitarianism, that might be surprising to some people. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a Trinity out there that's right.
Or a Trinity that is yet to be out there that's right, right? In fact, I would go so far as to say that the very nature of God is such that any formulation of the Trinity is going to be imperfect. And so what you probably, I'm guessing, have in these variations of Trinitarian thought are degrees of accuracy. And I suspect that when it's finally revealed to us what it is, I don't think even the most accurate of those variations will be entirely accurate.
Sure. And I'll let you in on a dirty secret. Biblical Unitarians actually have disagreements and diversity within us too.
No way!
Shocker. So I don't actually, I think Dale Tuggy sometimes might make too much of a deal out of that. And that I just explained, I actually don't view that as the deal breaker that he sometimes seems to make it out to be.
I think it's he's making a rhetorical move. It's an effective way to get readers to shock them and to be like, oh my gosh, maybe I was wrong all about this, which he may think is perfectly fine to do that. I think at least some people can be forgiven for thinking it's a little disingenuous. I think what we ought to be doing is persuading people by giving good and true content and good arguments, not rhetorical flourishes of speech that shock people into beginning to question things.
Although I think it was important for him in his journey from Trinitarianism to Unitarianism. I think that was one of those things that caught him by surprise, and that was actually something of an important step along his journey. So I can see why he relates to it. But like we've just said, I actually don't think that actually should count against you as much as it does. So that being said, I think it's as good of a time as any to transition to talking about the Incarnation. So, and that was actually the main subject of your book, was not actually the tridology of how all of these persons relate to each other and that sort of thing that we've been talking about up until now, but actually, and this is honestly what most Trinitarian, or what most evangelicals care about, like 99% of what the Trinity means to an average evangelical is that we get to call Jesus God or not.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And as the relationship between the Father and the Spirit, okay. But whether or not Jesus is God is actually seemingly what a lot of people care about in their personal faith and their personal understanding. At least when I bring up this subject, when I say I don't believe in the Trinity, they're like, what, you don't think Jesus is God? And it's like those two things are almost so equated that it's to say the same thing, when really, as we just discussed, there's a whole world of complexity behind each of those claims.
Although, to be fair, they would be right in assuming that's what you mean. Or no, let me rephrase that. They would be right in assuming, in thinking that's true, even if they're wrong to equate the two concepts. You don't think Jesus is the true God incarnate, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Although one could imagine, and actually there were such historical people that were binitarian, that thought that Jesus was the true God, and that just had God the Father and God the Son, essentially. I actually think Constantine was something close to that, but that's a whole different discussion. So one could not believe in the Trinity, but still think that Jesus was God.
Yeah, in fact, this is why I honestly don't know if I'll ever be comfortable debating the doctrine of the Trinity, at the very least, I would be far more reluctant to do so than debating the deity of Christ, because as you'll know from having read the book, my case is not that Christians were Trinitarian from the beginning.
Right.
My case was that from the beginning, Christians believed Jesus was God, and that all of these weird things you read in people like Tertullian and so forth are their attempts at reconciling these two truths, or at least what they thought were truths, namely, there is only one God, but at the same time, God became man and has a relationship with his Father in time. So yeah, it would not surprise me at all if there were plenty of otherwise orthodox but binitarians in the early church.
Yeah. So how exactly do you understand the incarnation working at a high level? And again, like I said, if you have like, I'm sometimes like this, but I also see this, that doesn't bother me. I view that as something like a more of an asset than a weakness. So if you want to explain a couple different ways that you could possibly understand the incarnation and what it means for Jesus to be God, and then we could go into that.
Sure. So my at the core of the doctrine of incarnation is the concept of hypostatic union. And as you'll know, the hypostatic union is so called because what is believed is that the divine being that Jesus has and the human being that Jesus has are united in his person, which the classical language is hypostasis, right? And so that's why it's called the hypostatic union. For listeners who don't know, the upsilon in the Greek is going to be transliterated as a Y in English, and that's why it's hypostatic union when the original Greek would have been hypostasis. So my view is that the one personal self that is the Son, although I wouldn't have said that he was the Son prior to the incarnation, he was one of the three divine persons in my view. That one personal self, outside of time has eternally, or outside of created time at least, has eternally subsisted in only one being, the being that is the divine being, all right? But in created time, in the incarnation, that divine person subsists simultaneously is a hard word to use because we're talking about a transcendent time.
One is temporal and one is atemporal, yeah.
Or at the very least, atemporal relative to this time, right? Created time. Again, going back to my author story analogy, both the story and the author exist in a kind of time, but they're not parallel, right? The whole time of the story exists simultaneously within the mind of the author, who is also in his own time. So that's my belief, is that the person that is the Son, the personal self in the incarnation, subsists both in the divine being that transcends created time and his human being that came to exist at a certain point in time. And I really like the author story analogy for a picture of how that might work. Imagine you're an author, and then now, instead of writing a story in which that features human beings like you, instead you write a story that takes place in an imaginary two-dimensional world. All right. So all the characters in the world in this thing are two-dimensional shapes, right? Triangles and circles and squares and stuff like that. You would be perfectly within your capability, especially because this is just an analogy that's trying to capture the transcendent relationship between the divine being and every other being in created time. There's nothing preventing you from writing yourself into the story as, let's say, a circle. Maybe the entire world in this two-dimensional world in your story is full of triangles and or circles, and you write yourself into the story as a circle, and you talk with the other circles in the story and you interact with them and so forth. That's you. It's the personal self that subsists in your human being, but it's also subsisting in the being of this one unique circle in this two-dimensional story that you've come up with in your head.
So here's my sort of question pushback on that sort of idea. Like if there was the character of J.R.R. Tolkien inside Lord of the Rings somewhere, there would be a sense in which it wasn't quite as really him as the author. Like if I were to go back in time and see the author in his office in England and talk with him, that is like the real him. but the person in the story isn't quite, it's like it's him, but it's not quite as real, right?
Well, let's press on that. Let's press in on that. What about the J.R.R. Tolkien, or let's stick with my analogy because it better captures, I think, the transcendence of God, right? You got two-dimensional versus three-dimensional. What is different or less than real about the circle version of you, the circle incarnation of you in this two-dimensional story that you've created in your mind that makes it less real than the three-dimensional you outside of that story?
I guess the two-dimensional person depends on the three-dimensional person, but the three-dimensional person doesn't depend on the two-dimensional person. And that's sort of like an ase kind of thing that we were talking about earlier.
Well, Jesus, if we Trinitarians are right, Jesus depends on the upholding power of all three divine persons who uphold creation, right? So I'm not seeing a problem there.
So, and I guess something, okay, fair enough. I guess also something like the first person perspective lives in the higher dimension, but it actually doesn't live in the lower dimension. It's almost like the lower dimension is a simulation or something of the higher dimension, maybe.
See, I would posit that that's only true because we're dealing here with an imperfect analogy.
Okay.
Right?
That's fine.
So just to be clear, in case it wasn't already, and it very well may not have been, I'm not arguing that the analogy of an author and his story is in every imaginable way applicable to the reality of the relationship between the triune God and the incarnate Son. I'm just trying to my reason for using the analogy is because I think it's the best way we can relate to this concept of the divine being transcendent over created time and all created beings inside of time. So yes,
it's a little bit more like being a video game programmer controlling a player in his own video game almost.
Yes, except the problem with that is that you've got it's one timeline. Right? The programmer is controlling an avatar in live time, whereas in the author story analogy, the entire time of the story is sort of simultaneously existing all at once outside of that created time. Right? The author is not, the story doesn't exist in parallel time with that's, which by the way, I think that can explain why the Bible says things like, for God, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. The point of that is not to say that what we experience as 1,000 years has a 1 to X, proportional relationship with God's experience of time or something like that. It's rather that a great deal of our time can be like an instant to him, but also an instant to us can be like a great deal of time to him because his experience of time transcends our own. But that's neither here nor there.
Actually, honestly, there is a part of that gets strangely close to what biblical Unitarians believe. And this is the weird thing. Like, part of me wonders, how much do we really disagree? And this is the weird part, is like, biblical Unitarians will often say that Jesus existed in the foreknowledge of God, but he did not pre-exist personally. And it's almost like what we're trying to say is God had the script written, right, from beyond time, and that now we're in time living out what the script has already written. And it's almost like, okay, I hear what you're saying, Chris. And that's almost something that I could say, is that Jesus now is the temporal manifestation of the eternal plan of God.
Yeah, but there are two, I think, definitional differences.
Okay.
Namely, number one, in the Trinitarian view, the three persons are indeed eternally distinguished from one another, not merely in the plan of God, but in God's very, what it means for these persons to subsist within the being of God is eternal and personally distinct. And the second big difference is that in what you've just explained, the Son exists in time. He comes into existence at a point in time, but outside of time he exists in the plan of God. But even then, that character is, or that figure, that person, whatever, is not God. No, it's not the divine. It's not true. He's not true deity in manifesting himself in time. It's an agentival
It's not the
relationship.
author himself. Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. I actually would agree with both of those differentiations, but there is something there that's actually a little bit similar. Yeah, and like I said, I want to make sure that if we're going to disagree, that we're actually disagreeing, and not that we're disagreeing verbally. So yes, I think those two differentiations were hitting the nail on the head in terms of what we think is actually different. So, so I guess would you say? So you would say that, so here's an example that will help maybe flesh this out a little bit. So Jesus was tempted, and I'm sure that you would agree, Jesus was fully tempted in every way that we are, but was without sin, like Hebrews says. And then James chapter 1 also says God cannot be tempted. Don't say that don't say that God can be tempted, nor say you when you are tempted that was God that's tempting you. I'm paraphrasing and not getting it quite right.
I don't have an encyclopedic memory of scripture either. Don't worry.
James says God can't be tempted. Hebrews says Jesus was tempted. How do you make sense of that?
Right. So I appreciate that because you, I think, already know the answer because you've read the book, and this gives me a chance to sort of tell listeners what they can expect when they read the book, or viewers. So first of all, remember, as we talked about almost 90 minutes ago, and if we go a little over 7:30 my time, that's okay, but we'll probably have to wrap up pretty soon. Remember that what I said was that that as that Catholic theologian that I quote in the book put it, being is that with which, through which, or in which the personal self experiences what it experiences. And temptation is an experience, right? So my position is that the divine being is in fact incapable of being tempted, and therefore any person that subsists in the divine being is incapable of being tempted. But the person of the Son subsists in the human being, in his human being in created time. And what happens inside of created time, by definition, has no it doesn't have any effect, any relationship of cause and effect between what happens in time and what transcends time. That's what it means to transcend time. Nothing that happens in the story can affect what's true outside of the story, outside of time or outside of created time. So what I offer in the book are so actually let me back up 1 second and explain how this part of the conversation began in the book. So Dr. Tuggy believes, I think he believes this, I don't think he's right, that his view is biblically motivated. I don't think that's really true. I think what it is it's logically motivated. He's trying, and admirably so, or commendably so, to try and understand the scriptures in a way that can be logically coherent. So when it comes to his challenges to the Incarnation, the arguments aren't biblical. The arguments are logical based on the Bible. And so he makes the very, he'll use the very example you just gave, that God in his very being is untemptable, but Jesus was tempted. And what logic tells us, the very first law of logic, the law of non-contradiction, is that something cannot both be and not be. And that's all he says. But as anybody who knows philosophy knows, that's not how the law of non-contradiction ends. The law of non-contradiction says something cannot both be and not be in the same way and in the same sense. So what I do is I in the book, I explain that qualifier to the law of non-contradiction means that it's possible for Jesus to be both tempted and untemptable, or immortal and mortal, or omnipresent and located at a particular place in time, provided that each of those contradictory pairs aren't at the same time or in the same sense. And I offer 2 ways, one each, that plays on each of those 2 qualifications in the book. So let's say, for example, that it's true that either the divine being is timeless, or at the very least, the divine being transcends created time in maybe some sort of hyper time, or some sort of time that transcends created time, the way that an author's time transcends the story's time. If that's true, then the Son outside of time or outside of created time can indeed be immutable, untemptable, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. But in time, in created time, he can be the opposite of all those things. Why? Because it's not at the same time. And then I offer a way of explaining it, or a way of accounting for it, that trades on the other qualifier on that law of non-contradiction, which is in the same sense. What it means so the words live and die are not univocal. What it means for a physical creature to be alive, according to Scripture, is to be embodied and breathing. And that's why you see, for example, all sorts of living, breathing creatures are called nefesh chaya, living being, in Genesis chapter 1, including human beings. And it connects what it means to be a nefesh chaya with God breathing his life-giving breath into a body of dust, as was the case with Adam. So to be living means to be embodied and breathing for a physical creature. And so to die would be to no longer be embodied and breathing. But it doesn't mean that that's what living and dying means for the divine being. The divine being isn't embodied and breathing. So to live and to die, therefore, means something somewhat different than what it means for a human being to live and to die. So trading on the in the same sense qualifier on the law of non-contradiction, we can say that even if somebody doesn't buy the created time distinction from transcendent time, somebody could say that Jesus died in the sense of what it means for a human to die, even though it doesn't mean that he died in the sense that it means for God to die. And so that's what I try to argue in the book, is that those qualifiers on the law of non-contradiction can be leveraged in order to make sense of what we Trinitarians think we're seeing in Scripture. And those, mind you, those are neither mutually exclusive. In other words, you can hold the one or both, but they're also not exhaustive, at least theoretically, right? There may be numerous other ways to apply those qualifiers. And so my argument is that this demonstrates that the doctrine of the Trinity and Incarnation, or the doctrine of the Incarnation, is not innately illogical. There are possible ways of accounting for it. And if there are possible ways of accounting for it, there may be many other ways of accounting for it that we just haven't figured out yet.
Sure. What I could imagine is the possible criticism of this is that it seems like you're saying that the person of the Son is divine and or human, right? Not divine and human simultaneously, right? You can imagine, here's divine characteristics, here's human characteristics, there's an overlapping Venn diagram, right? And in the middle is everything that's compatible with divinity and humanity, and then there's human but not divine, and divine but not human. Right? And it seems like temptability is compatible with humanity, but incompatible with divinity. Assume that we take that verse in James to mean that. And then what you're saying is that some things can be true about Jesus that are only true of his humanity, but are in fact not true of his divinity.
That's right. And the reason why I think I can make that, I can affirm those things coherently, is because I don't think that the divine being exists within created time. I think it transcends it. And
but
because
then
of that,
it seems like you're saying, or leaving open the loophole, that Jesus is not fully divine, that there are parts of him where divinity doesn't get to, or something like
no,
that.
I don't think that's accurate. I think what can be accurately alleged is that I don't think that the divine being entered into time and became hypostatically union with Jesus's human being. In other words, it's not as if the author's very being entered into the story and then also united itself to a human being in the story. I think the author of the story, that the author's being remains entirely transcendent of the story, and the person that subsists in the author equally subsists in the human being, or the two-dimensional being I talked about in my analogy, in the story, but he's not subsisting simultaneously in the divine being and the human being, because you can't speak of simultaneity when you're talking about transcendent and created time.
Okay. That seems to leave open the door to the accusation of Nestorianism or something like that, where it seems as if you have two selves. You have like a divine being, Jesus self, and a human being, Jesus self, and that there are things that are true that are true of one but not true of the other, and vice versa. As
Well,
if
but
there are two. Would you say that there are two son selves?
No, it's the same self subsisting in both the divine being and the human being. But again, if you go back, but see, I think what the distinction that's important here is that those truths you're referring to that are true of Jesus in time but not true of the Son in transcendent time, those truths are all truths of the being in which the person subsists, right? We're not the person that is the Son that subsists in the divine being outside of created time and inside in his human being inside of time. There's nothing, that's one person. There's nothing that's not true of that person in one time than in the other. But yes, I think it's very true that there are things that are true of the being, the human being in which the Son subsists in time, that aren't true of the divine being in which the Son subsists in outside of created time. Go back to my analogy. If you wrote a story of in a two-dimensional world, and you enter into this, you write yourself into the story as one of these circles. It is not true of you in your real time that you're a two-dimensional being. That is true of you in the story. But that's true of your being in the story. It's true of the two-dimensional being in which you subsist in the story. It's not true of the you that subsists in those two beings.
Okay, all right. Well, I have some problems with that, but I feel like you've made yourself well said, and that I want to respect your time. I'll leave. Would you like to talk about protective birds? Because
yes, please.
Yes, because this was actually one of the things that we kind of talked about. We glanced at in our last discussion, but never got to.
Yeah.
So do you want to briefly talk about your argument from protective bird imagery? I guess I'm sorry. It's a funny sentence,
okay.
But I'm not trying to mock it that way.
No, I don't take it that way at all. And it is true. It's not true to say this is a new argument. Indeed, I quote authors who made this argument before I did. But it is true that for some reason or another, it's not an argument that is very often leveraged. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think it's a really good argument. And I don't think that Dr. Tuggy, I don't think he came even close to offering any sort of meaningful rebuttal to that argument. So, excuse me. So here's the argument. As I lay it out in the book. In Matthew 23, verses 37 to 38, and in the parallel in Luke 13, 34 and 35, and what's in the mourning that Jesus does, the lamenting over Jerusalem, he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Now, at first glance, it seems utterly irrelevant to the nature of the debate at hand. And I get that at first glance, but part of the reason for that is because we're not steeped in the ancient Near East culture and the ancient Hebraic tradition that Jesus and his hearers would have been. So what I document in the book is that in the ancient Near East, in the centuries and centuries leading up to the time of Christ, the only time that the imagery of a bird protecting things under its wings, the only entity that analogy, that metaphor is ever applied to, is deity. I give the example of the ubiquitous sun disk that we see in all sorts of Egyptian iconography, for example. But it's not just in ancient Egyptian iconography; it's in Hittite iconography and Canaanite iconography. This protective bird imagery, where you've got the deity being represented by wings protecting kings and things like that. And then I point out that that's true also of Scripture, namely that all throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Old Testament, the protective bird imagery is only ever used of Yahweh. And it's multiple times, especially so in the Psalms, but a couple of times outside the Psalms as well.
How many protective bird passages are there in the Old Testament?
I cite, let's see here. I'm trying to pull it up. Ruth 2:12, Psalm 17:8 and 9, 36:7, 57:1, 61:4, 63:7, and 91:4. So it's certainly not an abundance of occurrences, but it is more than a few, and it is unanimous. It universally refers to Yahweh.
There are no protective bird imageries that ever refer to anyone else in the Old Testament.
That's correct. That's right. Mm-hmm. So my argument is that in that culture, that when Jesus appears on the scene, for him to apply that imagery to himself, knowing full well that every single person who heard him would associate that with divinity, it would be ludicrous to suggest he's doing so haphazardly or arbitrarily or even what's the word? Why am I forgetting the word to describe something that just happened?
Happenstance,
happenstance, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Anyway, he was doing so knowing full well how his words would be taken. Now, Dr. Tuggy's response to that, and then I'm interested in hearing your response, but Dr. Tuggy's response is language changes, it evolves. And, it used to be that surfing meant only surfing on a surfboard, but then the internet, became a reality, and all of a sudden now we talk about surfing on the internet. And Dr. Tuggy's argument is, why couldn't that also be true of protective bird imagery? Well, there's a really obvious flaw in that argument, and that is surfing had no socio-religious connotations. Right? There was no, and in fact, I guarantee you that a number of people, when they first heard the phrase surfing the internet, probably were a little confused. Right? It's common language now, but it didn't start out that way. But more to the point, like I said, this protective bird imagery had socio-religious connotations that weren't true of surfing before the internet came around. So I don't think that response qualifies or holds. So the reality that you've got to explain is how Jesus, knowing how his words would be taken by all of his hearers, nevertheless used it in an unqualified way. And I've yet to hear a good explanation for that is consistent with him not being God. Okay,
so my response to that would be this. First off, it's not a bad argument. It's not irrelevant or laughably easily dismissible.
You got to admit, Dr. Tuggy treats it kind of that way in the book.
He does.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
So I will try and live up to it by taking it slightly more seriously than that.
Okay.
And I will even lay my hands that like if we were to say there are some really strong arguments, medium arguments, weak arguments in favor of Trinitarianism, weak arguments for Unitarianism, medium, strong, etc. I'll say that this is, and we kind of lay our chips as they will. I will say that the protective bird imagery is a weak argument in favor of Trinitarianism. And I don't mean weak. I don't mean weak as in it's flawed. I mean weak as in it's some evidence, but it's not a ton of evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to say that, but just to be clear, it's not an argument for the Trinity. It's an argument for the deity of Christ.
Sure, fair enough. Yeah.
And there, I think it's a
I just made the mistake that I criticized evangelicals for in the beginning of our conversation. I equated those two things. All right.
You're every bit as much a flawed human being as I am, so.
Yes. So I will say that I don't have a way of refuting it such that it's either a neutral argument or an argument in my favor. I think what I am able to do is maybe say, I'll count it as some points in your column, but I don't think it's definitive. All right.
Okay, I would say this: if this were the only argument that one could possibly make from the scriptures, I would say it's a bit premature to rest the entire case on this one argument. I'll grant that, but so how would you account for it?
All right, so basically how I would account for it, the reason why it's a small stone instead of a big stone, right, is that a couple things that are its weak points. One, 7 is so I'm a statistician, right? That's my day job. 7 is still a small sample size, right? Mm-hmm. If you have 8 protective bird imagery passages, right, and 7 of them are Yahweh and 1 of them is Jesus, that's still possible that randomly the chips could fall that way. It's improbable, but it is not so improbable as to be overwhelming because it's a small sample size.
I would agree with you, but I don't think that that's accurately representing the state of affairs, because I think it's a mistake to look at only protective bird imagery in the scriptures, because the scriptures don't exist in a vacuum. They were written in an ancient Near Eastern culture in which this imagery was incredibly ubiquitous. So I would say it's more like hundreds, if not thousands, of examples, because you can find the winged sun disk. That's just one manifestation of this protective bird imagery in countless graves and tombs.
So like in ancient Persia, right? Like, you know, like Zoroastrianism, it has like, you know, the eagle, right, with the wings coming out, and it almost looks like an American eagle sometimes, right? And it's something like that, right? And it's on the ball or something like that. That's not like necessarily protective bird. Right, it's not like chicken protecting her chicks. It's
Fair.
more like a strong eagle on top of things, almost like in America we like in the flag of Illinois is an eagle on top of a globe, I think, or something like that. That's not protective bird.
But by the way, your microphone is
bird. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
That's more like fearsome bird as opposed to protective bird protecting her chicks or something like that.
Right, but surely, and of course, I mean, I'm assuming you haven't yet, and even I haven't not nearly done a whole lot of research in this area, but that could only be true of some occurrences where you've got bird imagery that may or may not be protective. You've nevertheless got tons of cases where the imagery does appear in ancient Near Eastern iconography, where it is indeed protective. The king is being protected by the wings of the deity, and there will be accompanying text that even refers to it in that way. So even if it's not thousands, it's more than 7, and it's probably, I would argue it's probably many more times than 7.
Okay, so that's interesting. And honestly, I'm not an expert on Middle Eastern imagery and stuff like that. So that maybe is perhaps part of the reason why the argument isn't hitting me so hard. So, but that is something that I would need to take seriously and look into, not something that I could just laugh away. So a couple other reasons why I think it's sort of a soft argument as opposed to a strong argument would be that I think that the text has an obvious meaning in that Jesus is just wanting to protect Jerusalem, right? And it's perfectly within the bounds of the Messiah to want to protect Jerusalem. And so it's like all of the meanings right there on the surface. So what more does one need to look for beyond just Jesus is saying that he wants to protect Jerusalem, but is sad that they are not listening to him, right? It seems like that's the entirety of what he's trying to say. So why look for extra meaning? That's part of my counter argument.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think there's a certain degree to which that makes sense. I think there are a couple of pushbacks I would offer. One is that it's not as if a protective bird is the only possible metaphor or picture that you could offer to capture the idea that you want to be protective of the children of Israel. So what you're positing that Jesus did was he was in a world in which he knew that the imagery that he does use would have been understood a certain way. He doesn't qualify what he's saying to make clear that he's not intending to communicate what everybody who's hearing him would have thought that he was saying. And yet he chooses that one way of picturing or offering as a metaphor, communicating his desire to protect Israel, when he had countless others from which he could have chosen. The second pushback I would offer is that actually I don't agree that the text is saying he wants to protect Israel. The text is saying he wanted to protect Israel. And some interpreters will say he's just talking about his ministry, his past ministry. But that's not going to work. Here, let me argue or read the way that I put it, because I think that it's not immediately clear, but I think when you laid it out, it's a little bit clear. This is what I said. Matthew places the lament immediately after the Lord promises to hold the scribes and Pharisees guilty for the murder of Israel's past prophets.
It's right after the parable of the vineyard and the bad tenants, right?
Yeah. I go on to say this indicates that by claiming the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem has stymied his own frequent desire to gather the children of Israel, which is the desire he's talking about, it seems to me that Jesus is referring to Yahweh's repeated attempts through history to reach the people through the prophets, just like that landowner in the parable or whatever, right? These parables are not communicating something that's taking place in the course of Jesus' ministry. It's describing the history of Israel, or at least some of that history. And so that's why I think that this is a little bit more challenging than that. He's not evidently talking only about his desire over the past few years. He appears to be referring to God's desire to protect Israel through time.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I would say, age and title stuff. But anyway, I'll leave
fair.
that point there. I guess another weak point of this argument is if it was so obvious to people of Jesus's time, I'm not aware of any church fathers or any early Christians of any variety making this argument. It would seem like if it were so ubiquitous that would be something that we would see somewhere in the church fathers.
Let me look through the cross-examination here for a moment, because I actually do think, if I can find it, that this is one of the cases where I cite some church fathers in support. Let me, if I can't do this in like 2 minutes, then we'll move on, but I'd at least like to take a look.
Sure.
Hold on one second.
I'll jibber jabber for you to buy you some time if you want to do that.
Okay.
So
sure.
like that's that. I guess to jibber jabber a little bit. One reason why I kind of don't like it.
I found it, by the way, but yeah.
Okay, go for it. Yeah.
No. I want to hear what you're saying. I'm interested.
One reason why I don't totally like this argument is I've been like reading a fair amount of like Christian Gnosticism stuff from like the early centuries and counter Christian Gnosticism, because I think that understanding a lot of the theological context of early Christianity requires understanding Gnosticism. Obviously, I'm not a Gnostic. I'm like the furthest thing from a Christian Gnostic, but they're worth understanding to get your handle on what's going on. Is that this almost sounds like the sort of the thing that the Gnostics like to do, that there's this hidden meaning in imagery and that there is symbolism and that the initiated understand the true meaning of symbolism, and that if you're in the cult of the protective bird, that you know what it means, but the outsiders don't. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying. I get it. But it sounds kind of like some of the arguments that the Gnostics make, where the true hidden meaning of what's going on is in all of this animal symbolism or something like that.
Well, I suspect that the difference is that the hidden meaning that they're saying you can be found, the Gnostics that is, it really does take somebody who's initiated to get special access to this knowledge. But in this case, we're talking about a ubiquitous use of imagery all throughout the ancient Near East. It wouldn't have taken anybody initiated. It would have been common knowledge. Now, why don't you see tons of church fathers referring to it? I would argue that I would suggest that it's because those church fathers, many or most of them, or all of them, were not steeped in an ancient Near Eastern, the same ancient Near Eastern culture that the Jewish people was in the century prior to those church fathers and prior even to the turn of the millennium. But the second thing that I would say is it's interesting that you mentioned the Gnostics, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the fathers who fought against the Gnostics very strongly was Irenaeus, right?
Yes,
and against heresies. Well, Irenaeus, who is writing somewhere in the latter half of the 2nd century CE, he interprets this passage as saying that the Son visited Jerusalem via the prophets, and later, again, by his advent. Clement of Alexandria also interprets these texts the way that I do. So it's not as if none of the church fathers...
But do they mention the protective birds, or do they just mention this particular passage?
Oh, I see. That's a good question. Let me look it up. So the passage that I'm referring to in Irenaeus is against heresies.
I'm actually in a book study led by Beau Branson that's going through against heresies by Irenaeus right now.
Cool. Well, yeah. So this is book 4, chapter 36, section 8. And let me see if I can find it. I'm getting there. It's a big section, so bear with me just a second. Okay,
That's
so
fine.
and without, so this is what he says, and I'm reading this as I read it. So if I may end up proving myself wrong, but anyway, this is what he says. Without using a parable, the Lord said to Jerusalem, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest those who were sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and you would not? Behold, your house is left to you desolate. For that which had been said in the parable, behold, for 3 years I come seeking fruit, and in clear terms again, how often I gathered thy children together shall be found a falsehood if we do not understand his advent, which is announced by the prophets, if in fact he came to them but once, and then for the first time. But since he who chose the patriarchs and those who lived under the first covenant is the same word of God, who did both visit them through the prophetic spirit and us who have been called together from all quarters by his advent, in addition to what has already been said, he truly declared, many shall come from blah, blah, blah." Yeah, so you're right. For Irenaeus, it's not the protective bird. At least it's not explicitly the protective bird imagery. It's the how often I have
How
wanted
often,
to do
yeah.
such. So let me look at the Clement of Alexandria really quick, just to
Sure. And I'll say an interesting thing about Irenaeus is that Irenaeus thinks that all of the Old Testament theophanies, from, you know, the burning bush to wrestling with an angel, and basically all the times that God is encountered in the Old Testament are actually the Son, which is a curious thing about Irenaeus. And apparently Eastern Orthodox people still affirm that most of the Old Testament appearances of God are actually the person of the Son.
That's a common evangelical Protestant view too. It's my view.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
I know that I'm already kind of over your time, but so like, so
we'll do a hard stop in 7 minutes, and
fair
for
enough.
Sure.
So God talking to Moses in the burning bush, which person was that?
Well, so that's interesting. I think it's entirely possible that we see all three persons at work in the burning bush. But I'm not going to spend what little time we've got left exegeting that text. But, you know, what you see is John saying that no one has seen the Father, and yet we have, no one has seen God, which I take to be a reference to the Father in that particular instance.
I wasn't going to call you out on that.
Okay, well, I'll call myself out. I'd like to think I'm at least somewhat transparent. And yet you have numerous occasions on which people did see God. In fact, you have Moses being said to have seen God face to face. And so, yeah, I take it that when Old Testament people think they're seeing God, I think they're seeing the Son, a theophany of the Son. That is my position, and I think it's fairly typical.
I mean, Irenaeus had, like, the Son he had a hierarchical binitarianism is really what I would call it, is that God in his essence was utterly beyond interaction or comprehension or anything, but that God begot a second God, and he really actually does kind of mean second God, and the second God is the Son, and we can interact with the Son, but we can't interact with the Father because the Father is utterly beyond stuff. Like, interestingly, like C.S. Lewis, like in Narnia, like Aslan will say that my father is over across the sea or something like that, where it's like Aslan is the son whom you can interact with, but God the Father is Aslan's father who is kind of utterly beyond or something like that. And so I think that C.S. Lewis sort of had that kind of hierarchical, God the Father is most high and God the Son is slightly less high because we can see and interact with him. But anyway, gotcha. I'm just sort of buying you time to find your Clement of Alexandria quote.
Yeah, no, and I found it, and you're right. He doesn't explicitly mention the imagery itself. Now, while that might weaken my case ever so slightly, let's be clear that all that's an argument from is silence, right? We don't have, in these two cases, Clement and Irenaeus, we don't have their reasoning for why these texts are indications that he is deity incarnate. It could be that, like, he's speaking in a prophetic, divine rebuke manner of speaking that only God speaks in, or something like that. They don't make that clear. So it does weaken it a little bit, in as much as they're not explicitly attributing it to the imagery itself, but they are nevertheless interpreting the text as a reference to deity, as I do. And at this point, we kind of just have to speculate why they took it the way they did.
Sure.
But again, but I just want to fall back on my first thing really quick. You know, when we talk about Irenaeus and Clement, or for that matter, Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, the writer of the Epistle to Barnabas, I think we're talking about Greeks, Gentiles, not Jews. And while that isn't definitive, it does not surprise me that that they would be less familiar with the use of this imagery in the ancient Near East as the Jewish people would have been. On the other hand, well, I mean, the Greeks are in the middle of the Mediterranean, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas the Jewish people would have been in the ancient Near East. So, I mean, yeah, it's conceivable to me that that imagery wouldn't have been as ubiquitous and obvious to people in the West as it would have been
more of a Middle
Israelites.
Eastern Hebraic thing.
I think that's at least plausible, yeah.
So, I mean, I'll give you a couple points for
right, I'll take them.
for the protective bird imagery. I won't give you a ton of points, but I will say more than zero. It's not a silly argument. It's not ridiculous. It's just not very strong in my mind. One relatively small number of references and no references in the church fathers, and a completely alternative, plausible, surface level interpretation of what Jesus is trying to say would be the things that make it from being as strong as it could be. Okay. So, but not silly.
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason why it's the third argument of the three that I offer in the text, in the book. So.
And it's not as if your whole theology rests on the protective bird.
Definitely not. Yeah.
Neither does my whole theology rest on defending myself from the protective bird imagery, right? Right. But I will say it is a soft argument in your favor that isn't in my favor, and I see where you're coming from.
And I would just say, I would argue that one big difference is that I don't think there are any biblical arguments that are in your favor and not in mine. I think I think that it's really boils down to people don't think that the Trinitarian reading of some of these texts is logically coherent, and therefore it can't be consistent with Trinitarianism. I think that's ultimately the argument. And so, for example, when Jesus says, you the Father, are the only true God, that in and of itself is not an argument in favor of your view and against mine. It's the argument that is logically incoherent in Trinitarianism that would be an argument against my view, and that's where the ways of making it logically coherent, I think nullifies that as an argument. So anyway, but we're out of time.
We're running out of time. Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I love talking again, and we can talk about that if you want.
We could, yeah, it seems like we have more to talk about. And honestly, that thing that you just said is like, man, there's a whole nother world that we could go there from that.
Yes.
But I really appreciate your time. Your book again is Jesus Human and Not Divine, which is co-authored between you and Dale Tuggy. I'll link to that in the description. I think it's a really good book. I think we only scratched the surface of what is covered in that book. So certainly go out and buy it. And that, well, I really appreciate talking to you, Chris, and I really appreciate a lot of the content that you make, and I'm glad that you're taking these issues seriously.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. You're a real pleasure to talk to, so thank you for being such a real gentleman and a scholar, as they say.
All right. Well, I'm not sure about either of those, but I'll take it.
Well, you make a good show of it, at least.
Fair enough. All right.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Why?